Hello, sense makers, and welcome to Making Sense of Ourselves, a podcast about the hard work it takes to figure out who you are and what you want in this world. I'm Abby Covert, and with me is my co-host, Alfi. Hello. Alfi, you want to say hi before I go on with my long intro?
Hey, everyone. It's good to be back with you.
On this episode, we're going to dig into the nitty-gritty of relationship building. And I would say if peership was the subject that brought Alfie and I together initially, relationship building is definitely the umbrella that has kept us dry throughout this whole journey of friendship. I'll be honest, I really want to dig into today's topic for a very personal reason. As a neurodivergent creative person who is also battling some chronic health concerns, I am prone to burnout, and I have had to make some major changes and set a lot of boundaries to keep myself well over the last 5 years. One of the biggest investments that I've made for myself on this healing journey was to double down on building what I would say is some of the strongest relationships of my life. And my friendship with Alfie is one of the outcomes of that investment. So today I want to talk about relationship building because I have recently started a long journey back from burning out over the last few months. And like all of the other times that this has happened in my life, this was a textbook incident. I was doing too much and caring too much and all the things too much, and I totally hit a wall. But there was one major difference this time through. I couldn't hide. I had invested myself into too many strong, resilient friendships that could see me when I was struggling and also refused to look away or allow me to look away. And Alfie was one of those friends that over the last 2 months bravely approached me and said, hey, something is not right. And that was only really possible because he actually knows me. And he helped me to talk through what might need to change. He listened to me cry and whine about how I have my dream job and I'm burning out anyways. He sat with me even when I wanted to run away and not sit there anymore. And the most significant part of this was that my burnout was caught earlier. And rather than taking a full trip around the burnout bend this time, it was more like having a cheerleading squad as the burnout train pulled into my station. And I mustered all the courage to tell the train to just keep moving right along without me. So today, I'm going to try not to cry. And I want to pick Alfie's brain about relationship building because he is really good at it. And because I've learned so much from him about what it means to invest in relationships. So to start us off, Alfie, I want to know, why did relationships matter so much? Why do they impact literally everything? And why can't a man be an island? I know you've been thinking about this for a long time, but yeah, why do relationships change our outcomes so dramatically?
Yeah, and I think it's a good place for us to start. But before we do that, I also want to just tip my hat off for you, to you, for taking on this challenge this time around, the spiral, with a new approach. I think especially when we face challenges that we've faced in the past and that have maybe not gone so well, it can be daunting to approach those same challenges with a new mindset. And I think you really did do that this time around. But, we'll get into the details of some of those things as this conversation goes. But talking a little bit about the importance of relationship building, especially when in my earlier years, it was a question that I thought about a lot. Because you might say one of the few skills, especially at the time, that I relied a lot on was my ability to connect with people and engage for many different reasons. And so as I got older, it's a thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I would say there are almost like two competing or two opposites that kind of are consistently pushing against each other that make our relationships so important. The thing that I always think about with regards to this that really sort of starts to put into place why our relationships are important is when we think about the things that we're good at and the things that we're not good at. Because, if you think about a person as kind of like an automaton or like a robot that has a series of tasks that it has to do and get through each day, it can be a little bit like you might be scratching your head as to why it's so important for a person to develop those relationships. Because more often than not, we find ourselves investing in people and engaging with people, and so many of them turn out to just be at best an acquaintance and at worst a drain on our energy. And so from that perspective, it can be quite easy to become cynical about relationships, especially when you're at the stage of feeling like you don't have enough of them. But the thing, and especially in our friendship, that that really steps to the fore is when you find a relationship that is able to do something that you're not able to do alone. And this comes to the question of sort of like leaning into strengths versus being able to be supported through your weaknesses. And I think this is really the center of it, and why I think we're social creatures is because in some sense, as a species, we've identified that we can't be good at everything. No matter how hard we try and no matter how much we would like to, we can't be good at everything. And so the way for us to address that challenge is by outsourcing some of our needs to our relationships. Whether that is, supporting you through difficult times, getting more in touch with your emotional self, being able to identify when you're maybe stepping into some of your not so healthy habits. All of these things that are aspects of ourselves that are so difficult to engage with alone, but more importantly, so hard to see in ourselves, that the value of the relationship is really seen when your own capabilities, seem to fall short. And so I would say the main thing that makes our relationships important is the understanding that we can't be good at everything, and it's not even clear whether we should be good at everything.
I really love that.
I think
framing.
that's
I think that's so compelling. Because then it's like, well, what are your friends' superpowers? Like, what are the things that your friends are bringing to the table that, like, what are you inspired about them? What is the thing that you wish that you could be more like? Like, I feel like looking at the people in our life through that lens could be a really interesting exercise. Yeah, I like that.
And,
I definitely see that in our relationship for sure. I know exactly what the things are that I'm not as good at. And I think I know like the things that you're not as good at. Like, I feel like that's what makes it work is not just the one-sidedness, it's the reciprocation of like, we do have particular strengths that the other has weakness in. And that makes it like nice little puzzle pieces. Yeah.
100%. And I think that's really what makes it valuable to invest, to at least first engage with a lot of different people, but then really invest in the relationships that you find to be valuable. Because I think also often like we have all of these friends, but it's not absolutely always clear why we're friends with these people. And that's a whole other question, I think, which we'll dive into a little bit further in this conversation. But before I go off on one of my relationship tangents, I also have a bit of a question from you, because, when we started this, you talked a little bit about how, the burnout train has come past your station a couple of times, through your lifetime. And this time was a little bit different. But I think it would be good for us to hear a little bit from your perspective. What was it like the other times round? If you think about the past versions of yourself, and times where you've had to face similar sorts of challenges, can you maybe paint a little bit of a picture for our listeners of what you were like back then, and maybe also what the state of your relationships were like at that point in time?
Yeah, I think that that's such a good follow-up question, because I am not, and nor have I been, lonely or lacking for kind, thoughtful people surrounding me. Like, it's not that like, oh, I was in a really dark place and all the people I was surrounded with were like dark, negative forces, and now I'm in this brighter place with new friends. Like, no, it's not at all that. The difference is actually in me. And I feel like the major difference is I'm no longer masking to protect myself in my friendships. Like, I'm no longer saying that I'm fine when I'm not fine. And I have started to distance myself from any relationships where I feel like that's the expectation of me. Like, if when you ask me how I am, if you're one of those people that just expects me to say fine so that we can move on with business, that relationship's probably very shallow and I shouldn't be investing in it as if it's a deep friendship. And so I felt like in the past, I had definitely been masking a lot of the pain that I was feeling, just not really knowing who would be appropriate to even receive that. Like, I don't think that I really had a good sense of what reciprocation looked like in friendship, and like how to hold space for folks. And I honestly felt like people tried to hold space for me, and it was almost like I ran away from that. And I did in some cases hide in some relationships that were bad for me, like other people that were wanting to hide from their pain too made really good relationships for me in prior seasons of my life. And also trying to like fit into places, be that at work or in social situations when I didn't really like belong there. So yeah, in those past situations, I think what happened was that I would find myself, I wasn't lonely. I had plenty of people I would classify as friends. I had plans, which said friends. But in the darkness, I was alone. And when people would see me out in the light, there wasn't even an opening to talk about the darkness. There was no recognition that I was hiding the darkness. Versus now, I don't feel like I could hide it if I wanted to. Like, I just feel like the people in my life are so attuned to my rhythms. Like, honestly, it's gone to a level where even joining a call with you, I told you this a couple months ago, that like, I almost canceled a call on you a couple months ago because I knew that I would not be able to hide. Like, it was just one of those, he's going to see right through this. If I try to go like, oh, I'm fine, let's talk about the podcast or something, he's going to be like, no, you're not fine. What's going on? And so, yeah, I feel like that was the major difference, is that I had to really let people in order to have the accountability of my own, stability. Like, I needed to have people that were on that cheerleading squad. Like, that metaphor, I know that when I was going through that part in the intro, like, it really did. It chokes me up every time I think about it, because I really do think about like this train pulling into the station being like, next stop, burnout. And every other time I have gotten on the frickin' train, I've been like, I know I'm burning out and I'm doing it anyways because I'm on the station platform by myself, standing here. And nobody even knows I'm here. Nobody even knows I'm at the station. They think I'm at work, crushing it, doing what I do. And that wasn't me. It was kind of like living with two sides, kind of that idea of two faces, where one of your faces is pain and the other is like, a mask for that pain. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say like it's so important for you to be able to articulate that, because as you were speaking, especially that idea of sort of struggling when you're in the darkness and being invisible when you're in the light is something that I definitely resonate with, and especially in some of the more personally challenging parts of my own experience. I've always found like the dark moments are not very common and they're not very long. But for a long time, they've been very isolated and in a sense, really intense. And that's like the part that's really unhealthy, because it almost like it casts a shadow on the times when you are in the light, because you're always like trying to be like, how do I avoid getting there again? Like, you avoid looking at it, avoid thinking about it, avoid even acknowledging it. Yeah. But inevitably, you'll find yourself there again. And the walls that you put up when you're out in the light to avoid thinking about it trap you when you're in the darkness. Because it's, in a sense, you've closed all the doors to anybody sort of seeing into that. And so like I really resonated with the way you illustrated that.
Yeah, it's like you're totally right. Like, there's not a lot of those dark spots, but it's almost like they get magnified when you're by yourself. And it's almost like they get to be this like, I don't know, like this personal narrative that you have of like what you're really like. And if people really knew you, maybe they wouldn't trust you or like you or be your friend in the light. You know what I mean? Like, almost like you're afraid to talk about the darkness, but that not talking about the darkness is what makes the isolation in the darkness. So it's this like vicious cycle. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Surprise, community members. How we live. So I guess at this point in the conversation, I am guessing that our listeners are starting to wonder, like, if you had actually invested enough in building relationships in your life into resilient connections that will actually nourish you in every season, like, what would that be like? Like, I don't think it's just time spent. Like, I don't think that I'm spending more time with the people in my life. Like, I'm not less isolated. Like, it's not that. It's something more. So what does investing in relationship building even look like?
I think it's a really good question, and I don't think I have the end all and be all answer to this, but I think I do have a couple of ideas that have at least proved valuable to me. And one of the things which I will touch on in this is specifically about the idea of introverts and extroverts, just because I think because that term gets used so much, it's very easy for it to become a blanket statement for anything relating to other people, rather than actually thinking about it in the way that was originally defined. And so, why I think about this so often is, especially during our work in the Making Sense of Yourself program, there was something that was absolutely mind blowing to me that I discovered, and it was like extroverts and introverts both have difficulties with relationships. It's just the difficulties that they have are different. On the one hand, there's this difficulty with being around a lot of people and being able to sort of thrive and flourish in that kind of environment, and especially over an ongoing and consistent period of time. But then on the other hand, there is the idea of being able to nurture and sustain a relationship, which I think is a lot harder if you're consistently making new friendships. It's like you only have so much time in your life. You can only sustain so many relationships. And even in the depths of Amazon, they've come to realize this. I think it's the whole two pizza rule idea, and it's like we can only have so many relationships, whether that's in the professional environment, from the perspective of friends and people that we engage with. We only have a limited capacity, which means...
What is the two pizza rule? I don't know about the two pizza rule.
Oh, so it's like it's sort of like a team is too big when you can't feed that team with two pizzas. Like if if the team can't be now, that's obviously not a mathematical truism.
Right.
It's sort of like a rule of thumb, but it's sort of this idea that beyond a certain amount of people, relationships and networks start to fray, or they start to fracture, simply because we can't manage more than that. And so one of the things that's been super interesting in our program, which I hope we'll talk a little bit about more, but is this idea of sort of thinking about relationships beyond the first engagement, beyond when you first meet someone, beyond when you have to make that first move and break through the awkwardness to say hi and tell them about what's going on in your life. It's like, you might say roughly half of the world finds that to be enjoyable and riveting and an aspect that provides value. But then the other half is sort of like shying away from that. Mm-hmm. But I think the mistake we then make is like, we then think, okay, half of the world is great at relationships and the other half of the world struggles with them. But I don't think that's true. It's sort of like one half does really well in the beginning of relationships, and the other half does really well when the relationships have already been established. And, from one of the things that's been so hard for me to learn, and it's still one of the things that I spend so much time trying to be better at when it comes to building and nurturing relationships, is the sustaining of a relationship over time. Because one of the things I know about myself is, if I don't see a person very often, even if we had what I thought was a super strong relationship, it just starts to fade. And it's sort of like an out of sight, out of mind sort of situation. And so I would say, like, we almost need to think about building our relationships from those two perspectives. The starting and engaging with the new people. And we'll need different people through different aspects of our lives, but then also the sustaining and nurturing of those relationships once the connection has been built.
Yeah. No, I feel like I have a very extroverted friend that I was texting with back and forth because she realized that we hadn't spoken since February. And she was like, I don't know how this keeps happening. Like, we just it'll be like, oh my gosh, months. And we just keep missing each other. And I said, like, yeah, I think that we need to establish like a regular schedule. And so we aligned on a regular schedule. And it probably took us like a half hour of texting back and forth to align on a regular schedule. But I feel like with the friendships that I've wanted to commit to, that has been like a really impactful way to go about it. Is just like pick a cadence and then put it on the calendar. And then if you got to keep moving it, that's one thing that tells you something about how you're prioritizing that person, how that person's prioritizing you. And it gives you kind of like this open opportunity to socialize just for socializing sake, as opposed to always waiting for there to be an agenda or a reason to have to be in relationship with someone. I find that that's really changed a lot about the depth of my friendships. Is like, there are times where we don't have much to cover. And that's when we end up talking about really random, sometimes very deep things. And then there's other times where that call just happens to coincide with something going on in my life. And I'm like, oh, thank goodness I've got that person on the dock, waiting for me.
Yeah.
I got a big old, crazy coming in.
No,
Yeah.
I totally get that. I'd even say on that point specifically is like, sometimes it might feel like there is nothing to talk about, but really it's like on the other side, that other person has got this big thing that they were trying to work themselves up to eventually mention and open the door to, and having that open space that is predictable and reliable. They may not get it right the first time. Maybe they don't have the courage to. Maybe the second time they get a little bit closer. And the third time is when they actually break the seal on whatever it is that's bothering them. So I think there is a tremendous amount of value in leaving room for the organic connection, but at the same time also being intentional about the cadence and the consistency, so that the outliers also still have a place and room to be engaged with. And I talked briefly about some of the experience or realizations which we had in the Making Sense of Yourself program. And there was a specific part of the program which focused on relationship building. And it eventually brought us to this wonderful idea, which still tickles me a little bit, called Connection Bingo. And I'd love it if you could share a little bit with our listeners what some of the thinking behind that was, and maybe also some of the things which you identified in kind of running that part of the program.
Yeah. So Connection Bingo is definitely one of the more fun pieces to the program, mostly because I think that it like kind of came out of nowhere. It was, okay, we really think that people should reignite some relationships from their past. We also believe that getting people to interview folks from their past about themselves, about different paths they might take, like those kinds of things are really valuable conversations to stimulate. But we also knew that like asking people to just come up with like a list of people to reach back out to might be overwhelming. So we decided to make a card of prompts, and we have a bingo card. It has 25 prompts, as a bingo card has, and it's grouped into 5 qualities that we came up with that kind of are the types of people that we would recommend doing this kind of like a cold call, or I guess a call from the past potentially, or like a call to rebuild. So these are 5 things that we would look for. Number 1 is somebody who brings perspective. Number 2 is someone who you could say that you admire them. Number 3 is they noticed you in some way. So somebody who feels like they see you, someone with a giving spirit, and someone who might be open to connection. So for each one of those qualities, we have 4 different kind of prompts, things like a person who has plenty of experience in a specific domain that you'd like to explore, or someone that you admire from a different generation than yourself, or a person who has a good coaching sense, or someone who holds space for other people to share. So what we asked our students to do was come up with the first name that came to mind for each of these prompts. And then our prompt to them was, if somebody comes up on this more than once, it's worth reaching back out to them. It means that they're really coming up for you in terms of this idea of reconnection or deepening connection. And so, yeah, that was something that our students were really intimidated by, the idea of interviewing the people that came up on their list. But I think that the card itself was very helpful to kind of get some patterns out on like, what kind of relationships we might be looking for and with who we might have them already in our life.
Yeah.
What do you think, Alfi? Like what about this was, I think it was a very powerful exercise. I remember doing it myself, and I was a little surprised by some of just how tough some of the things were to answer too. Like the gaps were really interesting. But yeah, how about you? I know you did this for yourself as well. How did you find it?
Yeah, so I think this is again one of the places where I found, especially even with between you and myself, but even among our students, there was sort of like two camps. There was the camps of the people who had like a whole bunch of answers for every one of the things, and the camp of the people who were like struggling to fill in some of the things and maybe didn't have a name for everything. And the thing I found that was so striking about that is it already is such a great pointer for you to see where are you lacking in the context of a relationship life cycle. Is like, do you have many different friends for each of the different answers, but you haven't spoken to most of them in like 4, 5, 6, 7 months, which is the camp that I fall into? Or do you have like strong answers for a good swath of them with people who you stay in contact with on an ongoing basis, but you can't quite fill in a name in each one of those, in each one of the categories? And I think it's already such a great pointer for a person, one, to get a sense of, which aspect of relationship building is important to focus on. But beyond that is like, is your support network lacking in some way? It might be that like, 3/4 of it, you've got a whole bunch of people, but there's this one aspect of yourself which maybe has been lacking for a long time. And that already starts to point to aspects of growth. I remember we had one student who, in kind of doing this, like, or they said that, they're a very social person and they've got all of these communities and places where they kind of go for support. And then in actually doing this and needing to write down the names, realizing that actually they don't belong to those communities anymore. Those are like, that was a version of themselves in a previous season. And in this current season of their life, they don't have that many connections. So I think going through the process of actually needing to write down a name and relate it to a specific personal need of your own is great, both in terms of finding people to reconnect with, but also as a status check for what your relationship network looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the, there's a open to connection column I felt like had a lot of really strong prompts. And one of them was a person who you wished you would have stayed in closer contact with. And that one, I actually successfully reached back out to the person that I had answered for that. And we have been like in pretty regular contact since then. And I think it's so interesting because one of the first things that person told me was how they had thought about me so many times over the years and they had wished that we had been back in contact. And I was just like, see? Yeah. Another one was a person that you would love an excuse to reach back out to. And we gave permission to our students to use the course as the excuse. So we had Alfi actually, do you remember you recorded them a little video to send to their person that was like, hi, this person is interviewing them, you to know themselves better. I thought that was really fun.
Yeah. And maybe one last thing that I would touch on about that is, for a lot of people, this was one of the more challenging parts of the programs. Because, it's one thing to go and reflect and write about yourself and be, super like reflective. It's a completely different thing to actually now take that reflection outside of yourself and talk to somebody about some of the hard questions that you're hoping to answer about yourself.
Yeah, I may or may not have one person on my bingo card I still haven't reached out to because it's just like so much pressure. I will though. It's like that person is in my mind though, as like someone who I am actively not reaching out to. And I mean, that tells me something about myself and about, I think that there will be resolution on that, which I will report back on when I have more details.
We look forward to it.
Everyone's like, who is it? I'll never tell. I want to talk about the fact that you actually run a monthly meeting about relationship building at the Sense Makers Club. And I want to hear what you guys have talked about. Like, what are some of the stories and lessons that you're learning? And do not out anybody about what they've actually said. But
no worries.
That's a sense of things. I know that that's a very safe space meeting. And yeah, from what I've heard from others, you guys have gotten some pretty vulnerable shares. So yeah, I'd love to know a little bit about what's been going on.
Yeah. I mean, so for anybody this is the first episode of our podcast that you're listening to, In the Sense Makers Club, I'm also running one of the discussion groups, and our discussion group focuses on relationship building and networking. And especially, I think post-COVID, this is such an apt topic, just because it almost feels like everybody in the world is relearning how to build relationships. And so I'm glad that I have the opportunity to sort of do this, and I have the amazing pleasure of running this group with Sahar, who is also one of the discussion leaders in at the Sense Makers Club. And so our aim is to have a space for us to not necessarily build relationships, but to talk about how we do it, because I think that's another subject that doesn't get discussed enough, especially because of how much it is a challenge for so many people. And so I think so far we're now going into our third month of these discussion groups. So we've had 2 sessions so far, and the first one was a conversation which was pretty cool for me. So our prompting question for the conversation was, tell us about the context or environment where you find it easy to build new relationships. And I think this was a super great one, because it's really the part of relationship building that confronts you first. It's like at any point in time where you're feeling like your relationships are lacking, it's probably because there is either a relationship that's missing or a relationship maybe that has changed over time. And so I think this was a really great one, because it's sort of started to paint a little bit of a picture of what things are like for people on the other side of the aisle. The more sociable and gregarious type of person gets to see what does a person who is maybe a little bit more self-conscious actually struggle with, and what could you do to make it a little bit more accessible and engaging if you do meet a person of that kind. But then I think it was one of the things that was also interesting is, like, as a person who is a lot more familiar and comfortable building new relationships, what are the things that I struggle with? One of the things I've had to sort of juggle throughout this discussion group is, like, you don't want to be the person who is talking all the time and talking over other people and sort of taking up so much space in the discussion group. And, it's easy to think about it as, why don't you just not talk? But it's like, yeah, if it were that easy, we wouldn't talk too much. And so I think that was one of the really interesting aspects of the conversation that we had in our first discussion group. Being able to look on the other side of the cold approach of the first engagement. And then I think one of the things that Sahar and I kind of thought a little bit about in terms of our second conversation, which is quite interesting, is like, and you and I touched a little bit about it at the beginning of the conversation, is like this idea of the life cycle of a relationship beyond the first engagement. And so our second prompt was, from your perspective, what are the different stages of a relationship's life cycle? And so at first we kind of went into like exploring like what are the different steps from that first engagement to finding common ground to like building some kind of rhythm or consistent engagement, and then maybe eventually to when a relationship sort of starts to simmer away or fade out and eventually close. But then we had an amazing participant, or an amazing sort of idea that was shared by one of the participants, which was like, maybe the right way to think about relationships isn't the life cycle, because maybe they aren't a thing that are sort of have to be birthed and eventually die. And she instead introduced this idea of having like a ring of relationships. It's sort of like you have your inner circle, those like 5 to 7 people who you see on a consistent basis, you engage with them, you invest a lot in that relationship, and you lean on them pretty often. Then you got like a broader sort of ring of people who are sort of like still good friends, but you won't necessarily rely on them when all hell is breaking loose. And then you have the even broader network of acquaintances who you meet now and then, or you engage with them for a specific purpose. And so I think there's definitely more for us to explore in this avenue as the discussion group. But I think like those 2 things already were such great realizations for me, especially sort of the potential of thinking about things less as a life cycle and more as like a ringed network.
Yeah.
definitely tickles my fancy a little. I don't know. What are your
Yeah, I
thoughts on
really
some of
like that
those?
idea. I really like the idea of the rings just because like I think people slide in and out of levels, like there's times where people will become really close for a certain reason in a certain season. Like I've definitely had like accountability buddies through a certain stretch of my life that like yeah, then they kind of slid back into the like secondary or even the like, kind of acquaintance.
Mm,
I think also that happens with location. Like there's people that when I worked in a certain office were like my inner circle of people, knew everything about me, knew what I ate for lunch every day. But then as soon as I didn't work in that office, they weren't in that an inner circle at all. Now all of a sudden they're in the acquaintance circle. Yeah, I really like that model. I was talking to somebody recently about like the level of friend that will come pick you up if your car breaks down, like and how like nurturing those relationships is so important because like I transplanted to Florida 8 years ago, and I only like this year feel like I have people in my phone that are not related to me that would come pick me up on the side of the road. It took me 8 years, and I'm so proud of that because I think like having that kind of stability in your local community, I think is like a whole nother level of support that you don't know you need until your car breaks down on the side of
mm,
the road and you need somebody to pick you up. So yeah.
yeah,
Mm.
and
Yeah, I really like that
I
idea.
I'd maybe also just maybe I'm exposing myself a little bit, but one of the things I've come to realize is like, especially because the like getting into the acquaintance ring and maybe even that second ring of familiarity are relatively easy for me, and I've got many people in that ring. It's
Mhm.
easy to convince yourself that you've got a strong network until something really difficult happens and you're like, yes, I've got all of the like 40, 50 people in my acquaintance ring and like, you know, 10, 15,
Yeah.
20 people in that middle ring, but like one, if that, in
Mm.
that inner
Yeah.
circle of person who, as you said, you
Yeah.
can call when your car has broken down and it's the middle of the workday. And that has
Yeah.
been like quite a learning experience for myself.
Or like who's coming to your birthday party even though it's raining? You know what I mean? It's like if it's nice, everyone's coming to the party and it's great. Everything's as planned. But like
Mm,
who's the level of friend that's coming to the party knowing that most of the people aren't coming to the party because like, I don't know, there's a tropical storm or something. Like it's
mhm.
like that level of like, yeah, the ride or die. I think there has to be a special inner circle for your ride or die friends.
No, 100%.
But,
100%.
yeah. How has it been like running a discussion group on that subject? Like in general, I feel like I remember when we named that group, it's making sense of relationship building and networking. And we almost wanted to put like a at the end of the networking part. But like, yeah, it's like, how do people react to the subject in general? Like, are people there with that in mind, or is it all people that really are like into that kind of thing, or like, yeah, what's the vibe?
Mm, I would say it's I don't, and I hesitate to speak on behalf of other people, but my perception of what it's been like is not, it isn't many of the people who love relationship building or networking or like engaging. It's the people who
Mm.
feel like they've got room to grow in that area. And then I think there are a smattering of people who maybe find themselves a little bit more comfortable, but are in a space where there is an aspect of their relationships that are either lacking or that they would like to grow in. So I would say it's been a subject that's been taken surprisingly seriously. Like it's very easy to think like you're going to talk about strategies and tactics that you can use when you enter like a room of people that are networking, and then it kind of very quickly becomes cringy. But I don't think it's been that at all. I think it's been thinking a little bit more deeply, and maybe also a space to share a little bit about the parts that you find to be more challenging, that are not
Mm.
so easy to talk about to the person that is in your network. Because I think there are parts of relationship building that are hard to talk to a person about who is in your in your network of relationships, simply
Yeah.
because of the fact that they're in that network. And so I think it provides a great space to talk to people who you only have to see, once, twice, three times a month, depending on how many
Yeah.
discussions you're a part of, and talk a
Yeah.
little bit about this in a way that both benefits you in terms of answering questions that you might have on the subject matter, but also benefit the people who are sort of there with you discussing it in order to get another person's perspective. So I think as a facilitator of the discussion, it's been a great experience and surprising from the perspective of how, and I don't quite know if taken seriously is the right way to put it, but more taking it with the right level of gravity, because I think it is an important part of the human condition. And so it's good to have a space to discuss that on a consistent basis.
Yeah. I feel like that's been a theme that I've seen in most of the discussions, if not all of them that I've been in. It's just like people are not taking the simplicity of the question for granted. Like they're taking that as an invitation to go deeper, and as an invitation to share their personal experience. And yeah, I think the relationship building one sounds really good. I want to try to make it to one of those one point. So you're on my list.
Always welcome.
I'm going to make it to every one of them eventually.
But yeah, I think that sort of is bringing us to the final stretch. It also brings us to our monthly question. Abby, how made sense of are you this month?
Oh, you remember how I said that we were like at the train station and the burnout train like pulled into the station and I was like, not today, burnout train. And like the train left and I wasn't on it. What if I told you I was still at the station, but I'm like in the parking lot in my car going like, okay, I didn't get on the train. 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 So I would say that's where I'm at right now. Like I'm really in a process of reconsidering literally every single thing and every single way that I'm using my energy and every single process. My kid just started kindergarten this week. So like that also has me just like upside down and backwards where literally everything about my life is different. Like I'm a lunch packing mom now and I have a commute that's like 3 times as long. And there's all sorts of new procedures and things with the school. And so, yeah, it's a lot of like freshness coming in at a time that I think I need it. But also I'm deeply aware that like I just come out of a period where I had to take some time off just to like calm down and figure out where I was at. And now I'm like right back into a very, very busy period. So yeah, I would say I'm not on the train platform waiting for another train, but I'm also aware that I haven't actually driven out of the station yet. So yeah. And I know that all of my friends are in their cars also in the parking lot and they're going like, why hasn't she left yet? Does she really think that we're just going to like leave and she's going to like go back in there and get on the fucking train? Like I sense that from you all. I don't know if you've like arranged a tailgate party or anything in the parking lot, but yeah, I'm aware that you all are there. Like, come on, key in the ignition. Wrong. So yeah, I'll leave the parking lot soon.
And we'll be waiting.
Yeah, I know. And I appreciate it. How about you? How made sense of are you this month?
I would say in the spirit of analogies, I would say I feel like I'm at a stage where, you know, like when you're on a flight, when you're on a plane, and like, you know, you fly smooth for all of this time, you're flying smooth, and then it's sort of like, okay, the pilot tells you it's time to land, and then, you know, you get the little bit of the vertigo and you hold your chair, your seat, and then it's sort of like you land, and then there's all the shaking and the vibrating, and then it stops, and then you're like, okay, we've landed safe, but yeah, it's still sort of going pretty quick and so on. So I feel like I'm there. So I just finished off a 3-month project, doing a kind of work that I haven't really done of that kind before. I was doing sort of like a internship / learnership type of situation, and it was getting me to commute an hour and a half going, hour and a half coming back 3 times a week, which was quite a bit of a shift for me. And so Now that that is over, I'm sort of like finding my feet again. So I would say, in summary, I'm things are calm around me, but it's still like I still feel the residual um turbulence.
I feel like you should tell the listeners a little bit more about what you were doing over the last 3 months, because I feel like, um, yeah, it's very much in line with a lot of the things that you've been talking about and wanting to do experiments around.
Mhm.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what you were doing?
I'm gonna do my best to not ramble because this is one of the things that's still in the in progress part of my brain. But one of the things that I have wanted to do for a very long time, pretty much since leaving my journey in education, is finding a way to make it a little bit more accessible to people in different forms. And so one of the forms was the project that you and I did together, making sense of yourself. But then I think this program was a different approach to the same kind of problem. And it was for developing a learning experience or a method of learning that's a lot more practice focused. So it was specifically in the area of design. And so we put together a 3-month program where we were working with participants to learn the skills of design, but while they're actually practicing in a real world environment. So actually having a client that they're doing the work for, learning the very basics of stakeholder interviewing by doing a stakeholder interview, learning the basics of wireframing by actually doing the wireframe, and doing that in a form that's much more akin to an apprenticeship, rather than a series of lectures or a degree or a course. And so I would say for myself, it was a massive learning experience, needing to go back in some sense in my own career and understand what the challenges of a person entering the industry are and how to make those accessible and understandable to a person who's got completely no background. And, maybe one of the notable things about this is like we had people who are like graphic designers looking to move into UI and UX to, the one lady who had been running a nail and beauty business up until now was in some sense completely new to this industry and design. And so I think as a person interested in making education more accessible, I would say it was quite a steep learning curve for me to be able to make this accessible to the beginner as well as the person who has kind of been skirting on the edges for so long. So
Yeah.
definitely some introspection and reflection to be done as a we finished last week Friday, so it's still feels relatively just finished.
Yeah. And they all, one thing that I thought was really cool is that they all left with their own e-com business.
Mm-hmm.
So like they didn't just work for just the client. It was like they were learning by doing on their own thing. Like the woman with her own nail business, like she now has like an e-commerce thing and she can have people like, did she like set up so people can book with her and stuff? Is that what it was?
Yeah. And thanks for bringing that up, because there was one aspect to that I did forget to mention. And it was like, I always had this gripe with like feeling like the things that I was learning were so far out of context. And then when I actually got a job and saw what was actually really required, it sort of feels like quite a bit of a shock. And so a significant part of this was not only understanding how to do this in the context of a job where you may be doing client service type work, but also doing it from the perspective where you've actually got skin in the game. So as you mentioned, the lady who has a nails and beauty business built a website for her business where she can both showcase the things that she's able to do, but also allow her customers to book sessions with her and engage with that. And then the other student who started like a little merch company. So he had been making merch already, and just kind of like selling stuff using Instagram and WhatsApp and like direct communication. Yeah. And so he was able to put together an e-commerce experience where he can now sell those things online. And so it was, I would also say it was eye-opening to also see the difference in engagement when a person understands that the result of their work doesn't result in marks, but rather money in the bank. It's like the level of engagement is completely different, especially if you're
Incentive
considering a
plan.
person who is, hasn't come from the most affluent background, has needed support in terms of finding opportunities and ways to get into industry. When they realize that the control is actually in their hands, they approach it differently. And so I'd say that was a really cool part of what we did.
Yeah, it's awesome. Congratulations on finishing that marathon. I know it was a long run. You did great.
Thank you. And thanks for also being my cheerleader along the way. There were definitely points where I was like, why am I running all of this way?
Just like throwing Gatorade cups like that. You're doing it. You're doing it. You're almost there.
Exactly.
There was a couple weeks in the middle where you were just like, it was the messy middle always. It was like you were so far into it that you couldn't see the beginning anymore, but you weren't far enough that you could see the end yet. And that was a predictably dark time. Yeah.
Definitely. But maybe to close things off for us, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the third month of the Sense Makers Club?
Yes, so many exciting things. So yeah, we are starting our third month of having members, and we are really starting to see some, I would say, proof of community forming. We've had some folks meet in real life. Someone was on vacation in another person's town and they went and got ice cream. So that was very sweet. We have definitely had some like spin-off things happening where people are like, oh, this is such a great discussion. Let's not wait another month. And we've had some like smaller conversations that have sprung up and people doing kind of like little explorations together. We have a little book club that started forming because there were so many book recommendations coming out of meetings that we started a channel. And then once there was a channel, everybody was like, well, why don't we just pick one of these books and then we could read it? So it's been really fun to kind of watch people take leadership positions on things like that and just like kind of push things forward on their own. We also have been running free public events. So I'm aiming to do one a month. So in July, we did one on accessibility pride, and we had a bunch of folks show up and do accessibility checks on large company public websites. And we have been assigning out letters to be written to these companies by sense makers that participated. So I think we had 9 or 10 companies that we were going to be writing to as a result of that. And in August, we are going to be doing an event called Making Lemonade Out of Lemons. And it's specifically about like, there are a lot of really amazing, thoughtful people that are on the job market right now, and they're all on the hunt and they all have an amazing amount of free time. And we've started to hear that people are doing really cool stuff with it. So it's kind of a time to share what you've been doing with your free time, or also a time to maybe get inspired on what you could use your free time for if you're feeling like all you're doing is scrolling on LinkedIn and feeling sad. So we're really hoping that that'll be a fun event for job seekers, but also open to anybody. And then this month, we're going to be experimenting with our first SenseMaker Mingle. So we're going to have folks paired up one-on-one with some prompts. And I think that'll be really fun to see what's going on in kind of like a very casual way, as opposed to the topic-based conversations that folks have been grouping around most recently. It's been really excellent. I mean, I just feel like the feedback that we're getting is that people find it to be a safe place that they know will be there day after day. Like that's become kind of like a water cooler, especially for remote people, like folks that are either working remotely or running their own game. All of that can be, a really lonely experience. So definitely seen some folks coming in from there. And then a lot of folks that are just like prioritizing the time for a few topics that they really feel are worth their time every month. And we're seeing a real commitment to those topics. I definitely have started to see little patterns form about like, if you attend this meeting, you're more likely to attend this meeting. And so, yeah, it's been really fun to kind of like start to see patterns emerge now that we've got a little bit more time.
Amazing.
It's fun. Yeah. Okay. I think it's time to shut this thing down. Episode 5. We did it, Alfi.
We did.
Exciting. Yes. Relationships. They're being built as we speak. Speaking of relationships, let's talk about the relationship that you have with us, listener. We are just really pleased by seeing how many of you are listening to the podcast. We do look at our stats on the Spotify and the Apple, and we're seeing those numbers, but we haven't heard from very many folks. So thank you for the 2 folks that left star reviews last month. We really appreciate it. If you're listening to this, especially if you made it all the way to the end, please hit the follow button, leave us a review with words, without words. We don't care. Send it to your friends, post about it on social. Yeah. And until next time, be clear.